Hello my lovely people, I hope that you're okay. We're just going to get on with the story today because this life, right? Today, the 14th of June, marks the anniversary of probably one of the most single heartbreaking tragedies that has happened in our lifetime. You may think this is not a crime, not in the traditional sense. Why is Yinka covering this on the anniversary series? And just to put it plainly, I do think it's a crime. I'm going to talk to you about Grenfell, the tower block fire that changed so many lives this day 3 years ago. The 14th of June 2017. I feel like it's a little bit disrespectful to say that time has flown when you're not on the receiving end of trauma. I'm here to tell you about what happened that fateful night just before 1 a.m. when a fire broke out in the kitchen of a flat on the 4th floor of the Grenfell Tower. Flat 16, the home of Bokinni, who was woken up by the fire alarm and went to the kitchen to see smoke and fire around the area of the fridge near his kitchen window. He called the fire brigade immediately and his call was logged at 12:54 a.m. 4 fire engines were sent to the scene, the first of which arrived at 12:59. London in 2017 in June was in the midst of an early summer heatwave, and many of the residents of Grenfell Tower slept with their windows open that night. Within half an hour of the fire starting, it had spread. It spread upwards and across the eastern side of the building, and it had reached the top floor by 1:30. There's loads of footage that you can find from people on the ground who were filming the tower. I'm not going to include it in this video because it's really triggering. We've heard a lot about the cladding to the building that was the Grenfell Tower, and we're going to get into that a little bit later in this video. But I want to talk to you about a few of the other things that went down on the night. The firefighters were ill-equipped to deal with the scale of the blaze. There was not enough water pressure in the Grenfell Tower. They didn't get a top ladder until a while after the first fire engines got there, so they weren't able to reach the higher blocks. The hoses that the fire brigades did have only reached the 10th floor, and Grenfell was a 24-storey building. I listened to a podcast on the BBC, and I'll put the link in the description box. It has lots of 999 recordings, and it has a lot of stories told firsthand from the people who were at Grenfell. It really paints a picture of what happened, told by the people who were there, not by the people who did the inquest after and told us that 72 people died. I was there myself. I remember going to help and just seeing hundreds of faces of people posted onto the walls, but the official death count is 72. It's really hard with something like this when it's happened in our lifetime to just tell a story straight, narrow, linear down the line, especially when it's something that has affected a lot of us. One of my sister's friends was one of the fire people who was trying to put out the blaze. For a lot of us, it showed the hierarchy of care that's given to people who look like us, to people who are in the same class bracket or wage bracket as us, because I don't think it's any coincidence that the Grenfell residents, the majority of them, were working class, council flats, immigrants. They were forgotten by the government, at least. I mean, they were told it would take 3 weeks to rehouse them, and 3 years later, over 40 families are still waiting. We're gonna get back to the story. Sorry, I've lost my place. Okay. The fire brigade implemented a stay put policy for people who were inside the Grenfell Tower while it was on fire. A lot of people had woken up either from the shouts of other people, from internal fire alarms, and when they saw the kerfuffle, when they saw the fire and they were nervous, they would call 999. And they were told by the operators that they should stay in their houses, that if the fire wasn't in their flat, the safest thing to do would be to stay in their houses. And we now know that was a grave mistake. A lot of the people who did die in Grenfell, I think it was 23 people, I believe. I think I'll put a link and I'll correct myself if I'm wrong, but I think it was 23 people had, instead of going downstairs to safety, went upstairs because they thought, I'll get away from the smoke, I'll get away from the flames, but they didn't survive. I should say that the stay put policy, it's all about the building structure and the building's layout. Grenfell was a tower block and it was supposed to have something that supported compartmentation, which means that each flat should have been secure and fireproof, and it should have been able to withstand fire for at least an hour. So when the operators and the fire brigade were telling people to stay in their houses, they were doing so under the impression that each unit was a fireproof unit. However, within half an hour of this building going up, it became very clear that the compartmentation wasn't working. The fire brigade didn't change the policy and people were still told to stay put. A total of 65 people were rescued from the building by firefighters. The stay put advice was finally abandoned at 2:47, so nearly 2 hours after the fire began. The incident commander gave the order to advise people to make efforts to leave the building, but it was already too late for some. I mean, there was one set of stairs. How on earth are people meant to get out? How are they meant to get out? By 4:30 a.m, the whole building was engulfed in flames with more than 100 flats on fire. I'm going to insert some pictures to show the timeline of what the building was like from about 1 a.m. until eventually burnt itself out at 1:14 a.m. on Thursday, the 15th of June, which was more than 24 hours later. To this day, it still remains the largest residential fire since World War II. In 2016, the tower, Grenfell, received new windows, a water-based heating system for individual flats, and new aluminium composite rain screen cladding. This is the cladding that everyone speaks about when they talk about Grenfell. So according to the application, the purpose of the cladding was to improve heating and energy efficiency and external appearance. The external appearance part of this is really important because Grenfell, even though it was a lower class housing unit, it was located in one of the richest boroughs of London, Kensington and Chelsea. The safety of the residents didn't matter as long as the building looked better for those who have multi-million-pound homes and businesses in the area. So you had aluminium sheets that are fuse bonded both sides of a polyethylene core, and then beneath these you had more aluminium sheets. They were fixed to the outside of the walls of the flats. An alternative cladding with better fire resistance was refused due to the cost. In the public inquiry, there was a guy called Professor Luke Bisbee who did a report, and he said that the evidence strongly supports the theory that the polyethylene material in the cladding was the primary cause of the fire spread. After the refurbishment of Grenfell, the doors weren't fitting and closing properly, the security doors weren't working properly, the windows didn't fit properly, and all of this eventually led to how deadly the fire became. In a report for the public inquiry, fire expert Dr. Barbara Lane identifies combustible materials used in the refurbishment of the tower's windows as another factor that allowed the fire to spread. The inquiry also heard that the building's smoke extraction system wasn't working. The firefighters, like I said, they experienced problems with the water supply because there was no wet riser, which is a water-filled pipe running up the building to be used in an event of a fire. That just wasn't there. Dr. Lane said exposed gas pipelines that were installed in 2016 were another contributory factor, and none of the flat doors met the current fire resistance standards. Work done on the lifts in 2016 left them unfit for evacuating vulnerable residents and aiding the emergency response. So when you add all of that together, the fact that this building housed hundreds of people, when you add the fact that the people in charge of the renovations knew that the building wasn't fire safe, that's when you start to realise that this is so much more than just an accident. House fires happen. The London Fire Brigade, they see to over 30,000 small house fires a year. But when you live in a building that is just designed to go up in flames if you burn an egg or if you leave your straighteners on, how is that allowed to happen? We all know that we live in an unjust world. We all know that bad things happen. But I just feel like the people of Grenfell, the residents of Grenfell, were set up to fail. This was a disaster waiting to happen. And even after the disaster happened, there wasn't much done to help them. Nobody has been held accountable for the fact that this building was a death trap. There have been no criminal charges brought against anybody. And even the then Prime Minister, Theresa May, at the time refused to even meet any one of the survivors from Grenfell. Like, come on. If we even put to bed the fact that none of us really believe it was only 72 people who passed away, what we know, what has been proven in the inquiries, is still enough for something to change. It's still enough for some action or somebody to be held responsible. The youngest victim of the Grenfell fire was a 6-month-old baby, Lena Belkadi. She died in her mother's arms as they were trying to escape. The oldest victim of the Grenfell fire is believed to be an 84-year-old called Sheila from the 16th floor, who had lived in the Grenfell Tower for 34 years. I think this is probably the hardest episode that I've done, and I think maybe it's full of more emotion than fact, but one thing remains. The Grenfell Tower block burnt down 3 years ago today, and no one has been held accountable for the amount of lives that have been lost and ruined.